Chapter 16. Man to Man. He lay sick and unmoved, in pure opposition to everything. He knew how near to breaking was the vessel that held his life. He knew also how strong and durable it was. And he did not care. Better 1,000 times take one's chance with death, than accept a life one did not want. But best of all to persist and persist and persist forever, till one were satisfied in life. He knew that Ursula was referred back to him. He knew his life rested with her. But he would rather not live than accept the love she proffered. The old way of love seemed a dreadful bondage, a sort of conscription. What it was in him he did not know, but the thought of love, marriage, and children, and a life lived together, in the horrible privacy of domestic and connubial satisfaction, was repulsive. He wanted something clearer, more open, cooler, as it were. The hot narrow intimacy between man and wife was abhorrent. The way they shut their doors, these married people, and shut themselves into their own exclusive alliance with each other, even in love, disgusted him. It was a whole community of mistrustful couples insulated in private houses or private rooms, always in couples, and no further life, no further immediate, no disinterested relationship admitted, a kaleidoscope of couples, disjoined, separatist, meaningless entities of married couples. True, he hated promiscuity even worse than marriage, and a liaison was only another kind of coupling, reactionary from the legal marriage. Reaction was a greater bore than action. On the whole, he hated sex. It was such a limitation. It was sex that turned a man into a broken half of a couple, the woman into the other broken half. And he wanted to be single in himself, the woman single in herself. He wanted sex to revert to the level of the other appetites, to be regarded as a functional process, not as a fulfillment. He believed in sex marriage. But beyond this, he wanted a further conjunction, where man had being and woman had being, two pure beings, each constituting the freedom of the other, balancing each other like two poles of one force, like two angels, or two demons. He wanted so much to be free, not under the compulsion of any need for unification, or tortured by unsatisfied desire. Desire and aspiration should find their object without all this torture, as now, in a world of plenty of water, simple thirst is inconsiderable, satisfied almost unconsciously. And he wanted to be with Ursula as free as with himself, single and clear and cool, yet balanced, polarized with her. The merging, the clutching, the mingling of love was become madly abhorrent to him. But it seemed to him, woman was always so horrible and clutching, she had such a lust for possession, a greed of self-importance in love. She wanted to have, to own, to control, to be dominant. Everything must be referred back to her, to woman, the great mother of everything, out of whom proceeded everything and to whom everything must finally be rendered up. It filled him with almost insane fury, this calm assumption of the Magna Mater, that all was hers, because she had borne it. Man was hers because she had borne him. A Mater Dolorosa, she had borne him, a Magna Mater, she now claimed him again, soul and body, sex, meaning, and all. He had a horror of the Magna Mater, she was detestable. She was on a very high horse again, was woman, the great mother. Did he not know it in Hermione? Hermione, the humble, the subservient, what was she all the while but the Mater Dolorosa, in her subservience, claiming with horrible, insidious arrogance and female tyranny, her own again, claiming back the man she had borne in suffering. By her very suffering and humility she bound her son with chains, she held him her everlasting prisoner. And Ursula was the same, or the inverse. She too was the awful, arrogant queen of life, as if she were a queen bee on whom all the rest depended. He saw the yellow flare in her eyes, he knew the unthinkable overweening assumption of primacy in her. She was unconscious of it herself. She was only too ready to knock her head on the ground before a man. But this was only when she was so certain of her man, that she could worship him as a woman worships her own infant, with a worship of perfect possession. It was intolerable, this possession at the hands of woman. Always a man must be considered as the broken-off fragment of a woman, And the sex was the still aching scar of the laceration. Man must be added onto a woman, before he had any real place or wholeness. And why? Why should we consider ourselves, men and women, as broken fragments of one whole? It is not true. We are not broken fragments of one whole. Rather, we are the singling away into purity and clear being, of things that were mixed. Rather, the sex is that which remains in us of the mixed, the unresolved. And passion is the further separating of this mixture, that which is manly being taken into the being of the man, that which is womanly passing to the woman, till the two are clear and whole as angels, the admixture of sex in the highest sense surpassed, leaving two single beings constellated together like two stars. In the old age, before sex was, we were mixed, each one a mixture. The process of singling into individuality resulted into the great polarization of sex. The womanly drew to one side, the manly to the other. But the separation was imperfect even them. And so our world cycle passes. There is now to come the new day, when we are beings each of us, fulfilled in difference. The man is pure man, the woman pure woman, they are perfectly polarized. But there is no longer any of the horrible merging, mingling self-abnegation of love. There is only the pure duality of polarization, each one free from any contamination of the other. In each, the individual is primal, sex is subordinate, but perfectly polarized. Each has a single, separate being, with its own laws. The man has his pure freedom, the woman hers. Each acknowledges the perfection of the polarized sex circuit. Each admits the different nature in the other. So Birkin meditated whilst he was ill. He liked sometimes to be ill enough to take to his bed. For then he got better very quickly, and things came to him clear and sure. Whilst he was laid up, Gerald came to see him. The two men had a deep, uneasy feeling for each other. Gerald's eyes were quick and restless, his whole manner tense and impatient, he seemed strung up to some activity. According to conventionality, he wore black clothes, he looked formal, handsome and comme il faut. His hair was fair almost to whiteness, sharp like splinters of light, his face was keen and ruddy, his body seemed full of northern energy. Gerald really loved Birkin, though he never quite believed in him. Birkin was too unreal clever, whimsical, wonderful, but not practical enough. Gerald felt that his own understanding was much sounder and safer. Birkin was delightful, a wonderful spirit, but after all, not to be taken seriously, not quite to be counted as a man among men. "Why are you laid up again?" he asked kindly, taking the sick man's hand. It was always Gerald who was protective, offering the warm shelter of his physical strength. "For my sins, I suppose," Birkin said, smiling a little ironically. "For your sins? Yes, probably that is so. You should sin less, and keep better in health. You'd better teach me." He looked at Gerald with ironic eyes. "How are things with you?" asked Birkin. "With me?" Gerald looked at Birkin, saw he was serious, and a warm light came into his eyes. "I don't know that they're any different. I don't see how they could be. There's nothing to change. I suppose you are conducting the business as successfully as ever, and ignoring the demand of the soul." "That's it," said Gerald. "At least as far as the business is concerned. I couldn't say about the soul, I am sure." "No. Surely you don't expect me to?" laughed Gerald. "No. How are the rest of your affairs progressing, apart from the business?" "The rest of my affairs? What are those?" "I couldn't say, I don't know what you refer to." "Yes, you do," said Birkin. "Are you gloomy or cheerful? And what about Gudrun Brangwen? What about her?" A confused look came over Gerald. "Well," he added, "I don't know. I can only tell you she gave me a hit over the face last time I saw her." "A hit over the face? What for?" "That I couldn't tell you, either." "Really? But when?" "The night of the party, when Diana was drowned. She was driving the cattle up the hill, and I went after her, you remember?" "Yes, I remember. But what made her do that?" You didn't definitely ask her for it, I suppose? I? No, not that I know of. I merely said to her that it was dangerous to drive those Highland bullocks, as it is. She turned in such a way, and said, I suppose you think I'm afraid of you and your cattle, don't you? So I asked her why, and for answer she flung me a backhander across the face. Birkin laughed quickly, as if it pleased him. Gerald looked at him, wondering, and began to laugh as well, saying, I didn't laugh at the time, I assure you. I was never so taken aback in my life. And weren't you furious? Furious? I should think I was. I'd have murdered her for 2 pins. Ejaculated Birkin. Poor Gudrun, wouldn't she suffer afterwards for having given herself away? He was hugely delighted. Would she suffer? Asked Gerald, also amused now. Both men smiled in malice and amusement. Badly, I should think, seeing how self-conscious she is. She is self-conscious, is she? Then what made her do it? For I certainly think it was quite uncalled for, and quite unjustified. I suppose it was a sudden impulse. Yes, but how do you account for her having such an impulse? I'd done her no harm. Birkin shook his head. The Amazon suddenly came up in her, I suppose, he said. Well, replied Gerald, I'd rather it had been the Orinoco. They both laughed at the poor joke. Gerald was thinking how Gudrun had said she would strike the last blow too. But some reserve made him keep this back from Birkin. And you resent it? Birkin asked. I don't resent it. I don't care a tinker's curse about it. He was silent a moment, then he added, laughing. No, I'll see it through, that's all. She seemed sorry afterwards. Did she? You've not met since that night? Gerald's face clouded. No, he said. We've been, you can imagine how it's been, since the accident. Yes. Is it calming down? I don't know. It's a shock, of course. But I don't believe Mother minds. I really don't believe she takes any notice. And what's so funny, she used to be all for the children, nothing mattered, nothing whatever mattered but the children. And now, she doesn't take any more notice than if it was one of the servants. No? Did it upset you very much? It's a shock. But I don't feel it very much, really. I don't feel any different. We've all got to die, and it doesn't seem to make any great difference, anyhow, whether you die or not. I can't feel any grief, you know. It leaves me cold. I can't quite account for it. You don't care if you die or not? Asked Birkin. Gerald looked at him with eyes blue as the blue fibred steel of a weapon. He felt awkward, but indifferent. As a matter of fact, he did care terribly, with a great fear. Oh, he said, I don't want to die, why should I? But I never trouble. The question doesn't seem to be on the carpet for me at all. It doesn't interest me, you know. Timor mortis contribuit me, quoted Birkin, adding, no, death doesn't really seem the point anymore. It curiously doesn't concern one. It's like an ordinary tomorrow. Gerald looked closely at his friend. The eyes of the two men met, and an unspoken understanding was exchanged. Gerald narrowed his eyes, his face was cool and unscrupulous as he looked at Birkin, impersonally, with a vision that ended in a point in space, strangely keen-eyed and yet blind. If death isn't the point, he said, in a strangely abstract, cold, fine voice, what is? He sounded as if he had been found out. What is? Re-echoed Birkin. And there was a mocking silence. There's long way to go, after the point of intrinsic death, before we disappear, said Birkin. There is, said Gerald. But what sort of way? He seemed to press the other man for knowledge which he himself knew far better than Birkin did. Right down the slopes of degeneration, mystic, universal degeneration. There are many stages of pure degradation to go through, age-long. We live on long after our death, and progressively, in progressive devolution. Gerald listened with a faint, fine smile on his face, all the time, as if, somewhere, he knew so much better than Birkin, all about this, as if his own knowledge were direct and personal, whereas Birkin's was a matter of observation and inference, Not quite hitting the nail on the head, though aiming near enough at it. But he was not going to give himself away. If Birkin could get at the secrets, let him. Gerald would never help him. Gerald would be a dark horse to the end. Of course, he said, with a startling change of conversation, it is father who really feels it. It will finish him. For him the world collapses. All his care now is for Winnie, he must save Winnie. He says she ought to be sent away to school, but she won't hear of it, and he'll never do it. Of course she is in rather a queer way. We're all of us curiously bad at living. We can do things, but we can't get on with life at all. It's curious, a family failing. She oughtn't to be sent away to school, said Birkin, who was considering a new proposition. She oughtn't. Why? She's a queer child, a special child, more special even than you. And in my opinion special children should never be sent away to school. Only moderately ordinary children should be sent to school, so it seems to me. I'm inclined to think just the opposite. I think it would probably make her more normal if she went away and mixed with other children. She wouldn't mix, you see. You never really mixed, did you? And she wouldn't be willing even to pretend to. She's proud, and solitary, and naturally apart. If she has a single nature, why do you want to make her gregarious? No, I don't want to make her anything. But I think school would be good for her. Was it good for you? Gerald's eyes narrowed uglily. School had been torture to him. Yet he had not questioned whether one should go through this torture. He seemed to believe in education through subjection and torment. I hated it at the time, but I can see it was necessary, he said. It brought me into line a bit, and you can't live unless you do come into line somewhere. Well, said Birkin, I begin to think that you can't live unless you keep entirely out of the line. It's no good trying to toe the line, when your one impulse is to smash up the line. Winnie is a special nature, and for special natures you must give a special world. Yes, but where's your special world? Said Gerald. Make it. Instead of chopping yourself down to fit the world, chop the world down to fit yourself. As a matter of fact, two exceptional people make another world. You and I, we make another, separate world. You don't want a world same as your brothers-in-law. It's just the special quality you value. Do you want to be normal or ordinary? It's a lie. You want to be free and extraordinary, in an extraordinary world of liberty. Gerald looked at Birkin with subtle eyes of knowledge. But he would never openly admit what he felt. He knew more than Birkin, in one direction, much more. And this gave him his gentle love for the other man, as if Birkin were in some way young, innocent, childlike, so amazingly clever, but incurably innocent. Yet you are so banal as to consider me chiefly a freak, said Birkin pointedly. A freak? Exclaimed Gerald, startled. And his face opened suddenly, as if lighted with simplicity, as when a flower opens out of the cunning bud. No, I never consider you a freak. And he watched the other man with strange eyes, that Birkin could not understand. I feel, Gerald continued, that there is always an element of uncertainty about you, perhaps you are uncertain about yourself. But I'm never sure of you. You can go away and change as easily as if you had no soul. He looked at Birkin with penetrating eyes. Birkin was amazed. He thought he had all the soul in the world. He stared in amazement. And Gerald, watching, saw the amazing attractive goodliness of his eyes, a young, spontaneous goodness that attracted the other man infinitely, yet filled him with bitter chagrin, because he mistrusted it so much. He knew Birkin could do without him, could forget, and not suffer. This was always present in Gerald's consciousness, filling him with bitter unbelief, this consciousness of the young, animal-like spontaneity of detachment. It seemed almost like hypocrisy and lying, sometimes, oh, often, on Birkin's part, to talk so deeply and importantly. Quite other things were going through Birkin's mind. Suddenly he saw himself confronted with another problem, the problem of love and eternal conjunction between two men. Of course this was necessary, It had been a necessity inside himself all his life, to love a man purely and fully. Of course he had been loving Gerald all along, and all along denying it. He lay in the bed and wondered, whilst his friend sat beside him, lost and brooding. Each man was gone in his own thoughts. "You know how the old German knights used to swear a Blutbruderschaft," he said to Gerald, with quite a new happy activity in his eyes. "Make a little wound in their arms, and rub each other's blood into the cut?" said Gerald. "Yes, and swear to be true to each other, of one blood, all their lives. That is what we ought to do. No wounds, that is obsolete. But we ought to swear to love each other, you and I, implicitly, and perfectly, finally, without any possibility of going back on it." He looked at Gerald with clear, happy eyes of discovery. Gerald looked down at him, attracted, so deeply bondaged in fascinated attraction, that he was mistrustful, resenting the bondage, hating the attraction. "We will swear to each other, one day, shall we?" pleaded Birkin. "We will swear to stand by each other, be true to each other, ultimately, infallibly, given to each other, organically, without possibility of taking back." Birkin sought hard to express himself. But Gerald hardly listened. His face shone with a certain luminous pleasure. He was pleased. But he kept his reserve. He held himself back. "Shall we swear to each other, one day?" said Birkin, putting out his hand towards Gerald. Gerald just touched the extended fine, living hand, as if withheld and afraid. "We'll leave it till I understand it better," he said, in a voice of excuse. Birkin watched him. A little sharp disappointment, perhaps a touch of contempt came into his heart. "Yes," he said. "You must tell me what you think, later. You know what I mean? Not sloppy emotionalism. An impersonal union that leaves one free." They lapsed both into silence. Birkin was looking at Gerald all the time. He seemed now to see, not the physical, animal man, which he usually saw in Gerald, and which usually he liked so much, but the man himself, complete, and as if fated, doomed, elt-dead. This strange sense of fatality in Gerald, as if he were limited to one form of existence, one knowledge, one activity, a sort of fatal halfness, which to himself seemed wholeness, always overcame Birkin after their moments of passionate approach, and filled him with a sort of contempt, or boredom. It was the insistence on the limitation which so bored Birkin and Gerald. Gerald could never fly away from himself, in real indifferent gaiety. He had a clog, a sort of monomania. There was silence for a time. Then Birkin said, in a lighter tone, letting the stress of the contact pass, "Can't you get a good governess for Winifred? Somebody exceptional?" Hermione Rodgers suggested we should ask Gudrun to teach her to draw and to model in clay. "You know Winnie is astonishingly clever with that plasticine stuff. Hermione declares she is an artist." Gerald spoke in the usual animated, chatty manner, as if nothing unusual had passed. But Birkin's manner was full of reminder. "Really? I didn't know that. Oh well then, if Gudrun would teach her, it would be perfect, couldn't be anything better, if Winifred is an artist. Because Gudrun somewhere is one. And every true artist is the salvation of every other. I thought they got on so badly, as a rule. Perhaps. But only artists produce for each other the world that is fit to live in. If you can arrange that for Winifred, it is perfect? But you think she wouldn't come?" "I don't know. Gudrun is rather self-opinionated. She won't go cheap anywhere. Or if she does, she'll pretty soon take herself back. So whether she would condescend to do private teaching, particularly here, in Beldover, I don't know. But it would be just the thing. Winifred has got a special nature. And if you can put into her way the means of being self-sufficient, that is the best thing possible. She'll never get on with the ordinary life. You find it difficult enough yourself, and she is several skins thinner than you are. It is awful to think what her life will be like unless she does find a means of expression, some way of fulfillment. You can see what mere leaving it to fate brings. You can see how much marriage is to be trusted to. Look at your own mother. Do you think mother is abnormal? No. I think she only wanted something more, or other than the common run of life. And not getting it, she has gone wrong perhaps. After producing a brood of wrong children, said Gerald gloomily. No more wrong than any of the rest of us, Birkin replied. The most normal people have the worst subterranean selves, take them one by one. Sometimes I think it is a curse to be alive, said Gerald with sudden impotent anger. Well, said Birkin, why not? Let it be a curse sometimes to be alive, at other times it is anything but a curse. You've got plenty of zest in it really. Less than you'd think, said Gerald, revealing a strange poverty in his look at the other man. There was silence, each thinking his own thoughts. I don't see what she has to distinguish between teaching at the grammar school, and coming to teach Wynne, said Gerald. The difference between a public servant and a private one. The only nobleman today, king and only aristocrat, is the public, the public. You are quite willing to serve the public, but to be a private tutor, I don't want to serve either, no. And Gudrun will probably feel the same. Gerald thought for a few minutes. Then he said, at all events, father won't make her feel like a private servant. He will be fussy and grateful enough. So he ought. And so ought all of you. Do you think you can hire a woman like Gudrun Brangwen with money? She is your equal like anything, probably your superior. Is she? Said Gerald. Yes, and if you haven't the guts to know it, I hope she'll leave you to your own devices. Nevertheless, said Gerald, if she is my equal, I wish she weren't a teacher, because I don't think teachers as a rule are my equal. Nor do I, damn them. But am I a teacher because I teach, or a parson because I preach? Gerald laughed. He was always uneasy on this score. He did not want to claim social superiority, yet he would not claim intrinsic personal superiority, because he would never base his standard of values on pure being. So he wobbled upon a tacit assumption of social standing. No, Birkin wanted him to accept the fact of intrinsic difference between human beings, which he did not intend to accept. It was against his social honor, his principle. He rose to go. I've been neglecting my business all this while, he said smiling. I ought to have reminded you before, Birkin replied, laughing and mocking. I knew you'd say something like that, laughed Gerald, rather uneasily. Did you? Yes, Rupert. It wouldn't do for us all to be like you are, we should soon be in the cart. When I am above the world, I shall ignore all businesses. Of course, we're not in the cart now, said Birkin, satirically. Not as much as you make out. At any rate, we have enough to eat and drink, and be satisfied, added Birkin. Gerald came near the bed and stood looking down at Birkin, whose throat was exposed, whose tossed hair fell attractively on the warm brow, above the eyes that were so unchallenged and still in the satirical face. Gerald, full-limbed and turgid with energy, stood unwilling to go. He was held by the presence of the other man. He had not the power to go away. So, said Birkin. Goodbye. And he reached out his hand from under the bedclothes, smiling with a glimmering look. Goodbye, said Gerald, taking the warm hand of his friend in a firm grasp. I shall come again. I miss you down at the mill. I'll be there in a few days, said Birkin. The eyes of the two men met again. Gerald's, that were keen as a hawk's, were suffused now with warm light and with unadmitted love. Birkin looked back as out of a darkness, unsounded and unknown, yet with a kind of warmth that seemed to flow over Gerald's brain like a fertile sleep. Goodbye then. There's nothing I can do for you? Nothing, thanks. Birkin watched the black-clothed form of the other man move out of the door. The bright head was gone. He turned over to sleep. Chapter 17. The Industrial Magnate. In Beldover, there was both for Ursula and for Gudrun an interval. It seemed to Ursula as if Birkin had gone out of her for the time. He had lost his significance, he scarcely mattered in her world. She had her own friends, her own activities, her own life. She turned back to the old ways with zest, away from him. And Gudrun, after feeling every moment in all her veins conscious of Gerald Crich, connected even physically with him, was now almost indifferent to the thought of him. She was nursing new schemes for going away and trying a new form of life. All the time, there was something in her urging her to avoid the final establishing of a relationship with Gerald. She felt it would be wiser and better to have no more than a casual acquaintance with him. She had a scheme for going to St. Petersburg, where she had a friend who was a sculptor like herself, and who lived with a wealthy Russian whose hobby was jewel making. The emotional, rather rootless life of the Russians appealed to her. She did not want to go to Paris. Paris was dry, and essentially boring. She would like to go to Rome, Munich, Vienna, or to St. Petersburg or Moscow. She had a friend in St. Petersburg and a friend in Munich. To each of these she wrote, asking about rooms. She had a certain amount of money. She had come home partly to save, and now she had sold several pieces of work. She had been praised in various shows. She knew she could become quite the go if she went to London. But she knew London, she wanted something else. She had £70, of which nobody knew anything. She would move soon as she heard from her friends. Her nature, in spite of her apparent placidity and calm, was profoundly restless. The sisters happened to call in a cottage in Willey Green to buy honey. Mrs. Kirk, a stout, pale, sharp-nosed woman, sly, honeyed, with something shrewish and cat-like beneath, asked the girls into her too tidy kitchen. There was a cat-like comfort and cleanliness everywhere. "Yes, Miss Brangwen," she said, in her slightly whining, insinuating voice, "and how do you like being back in the old place, then?" Gudrun, whom she addressed, hated her at once. "I don't care for it," she replied abruptly. "You don't? Eh? Well, I suppose you found a difference from London. You like life, and big, grand places. Some of us has to be content with Willey Green and Beldover. And what do you think of our grammar school, as there's so much talk about?" "What do I think of it?" Gudrun looked round at her slowly. "Do you mean, do I think it's a good school?" "Yes. What is your opinion of it?" "I do think it's a good school." Gudrun was very cold and repelling. She knew the common people hated the school. "Eh, you do, then? I've heard so much, one way and the other. It's nice to know what those that's in it feel. But opinions vary, don't they? Mr. Crich up at High Close is all for it." "Eh? Poor man, I'm afraid he's not long for this world. He's very poorly." "Is he worse?" asked Ursula. "Eh, yes, since they lost Miss Diana. He's gone off to a shadow. Poor man, he's had a world of trouble." "Has he?" asked Gudrun, faintly ironic. "He has, a world of trouble. And as nice and kind a gentleman as ever you could wish to meet. His children don't take after him." "I suppose they take after their mother?" said Ursula. "In many ways." Mrs. Crich lowered her voice a little. She was a proud haughty lady when she came into these parts, my word, she was that. She mustn't be looked at, and it was worth your life to speak to her. The woman made a dry, sly face. "Did you know her when she was first married?" "Yes, I knew her. I nursed 3 of her children. And proper little terrors they were, little fiends. That Gerald was a demon if ever there was one, a proper demon, at 6 months old." A curious malicious, sly tone came into the woman's voice. "Really," said Gudrun. "That willful, masterful, he'd mastered one nurse at 6 months. Kick, and scream, and struggle like a demon. Many's the time I've pinched his little bottom for him, when he was a child in arms. And he'd have been better if he'd had it pinched oftener. But she wouldn't have them corrected, no, wouldn't hear of it. I can remember the rows she had with Mr. Crich, my word. When he'd got worked up, properly worked up till he could stand no more, he'd lock the study door and whip them. But she paced up and down all the while like a tiger outside, like a tiger, with very murder in her face. She had a face that could look death. And when the door was opened, she'd go in with her hands lifted. "What have you been doing to my children, you coward?" She was like one out of her mind. I believe he was frightened of her, He had to be driven mad before he'd lift a finger. Didn't the servants have a life of it? And didn't we used to be thankful when one of them caught it? They were the torment of your life. Really? Said Gudrun. In every possible way. If you wouldn't let them smash their pots on the table, if you wouldn't let them drag the kitten about with a string round its neck, if you wouldn't give them whatever they asked for, every mortal thing, then there was a shine on, and their mother coming in asking, "What's the matter with him? What have you done to him? What is it, darling?" And then she'd turn on you as if she'd trample you under her feet. But she didn't trample on me. I was the only one that could do anything with her demons, for she wasn't going to be bothered with them herself. No, she took no trouble for them. But they must just have their way, they mustn't be spoken to. And Master Gerald was the beauty. I left when he was 1.5 years, I could stand no more. But I pinched his little bottom for him when he was in arms, I did, when there was no holding him, and I'm not sorry I did. Gudrun went away in fury and loathing. The phrase, "I pinched his little bottom for him," sent her into a white, stony fury. She could not bear it, she wanted to have the woman taken out at once and strangled. And yet there the phrase was lodged in her mind forever, beyond escape. She felt, one day, she would have to tell him, to see how he took it. And she loathed herself for the thought. But at Shortlands the lifelong struggle was coming to a close. The father was ill and was going to die. He had bad internal pains, which took away all his attentive life, and left him with only a vestige of his consciousness. More and more a silence came over him, he was less and less acutely aware of his surroundings. The pain seemed to absorb his activity. He knew it was there, he knew it would come again. It was like something lurking in the darkness within him. And he had not the power, or the will, to seek it out and to know it. There it remained in the darkness, the great pain, tearing him at times, and then being silent. And when it tore him he crouched in silent subjection under it, and when it left him alone again, he refused to know of it. It was within the darkness, let it remain unknown. So he never admitted it, except in a secret corner of himself, where all his never revealed fears and secrets were accumulated. For the rest, he had a pain, it went away, it made no difference. It even stimulated him, excited him. But it gradually absorbed his life. Gradually it drew away all his potentiality, it bled him into the dark, it weaned him of life and drew him away into the darkness. And in this twilight of his life little remained visible to him. The business, his work, that was gone entirely. His public interests had disappeared as if they had never been. Even his family had become extraneous to him, he could only remember, in some slight non-essential part of himself, that such and such were his children. But it was historical fact, not vital to him. He had to make an effort to know their relation to him. Even his wife barely existed. She indeed was like the darkness, like the pain within him. By some strange association, the darkness that contained the pain and the darkness that contained his wife were identical. All his thoughts and understandings became blurred and fused, and now his wife and the consuming pain were the same dark secret power against him, that he never faced. He never drove the dread out of its lair within him. He only knew that there was a dark place, and something inhabiting this darkness which issued from time to time and rend him. But he dared not penetrate and drive the beast into the open. He had rather ignore its existence. Only, in his vague way, the dread was his wife, the destroyer, and it was the pain, the destruction, a darkness which was one and both. He very rarely saw his wife. She kept her room. Only occasionally she came forth, with her head stretched forward, and in her low, possessed voice, she asked him how he was. And he answered her, in the habit of more than 30 years, "Well, I don't think I'm any the worse, dear." But he was frightened of her, underneath this safeguard of habit, frightened almost to the verge of death. But all his life, he had been so constant to his lights, he had never broken down. He would die even now without breaking down, without knowing what his feelings were, towards her. All his life, he had said, "Poor Christiana, she has such a strong temper." With unbroken will, he had stood by this position with regard to her. He had substituted pity for all his hostility. Pity had been his shield and his safeguard, and his infallible weapon. And still, in his consciousness, he was sorry for her. Her nature was so violent and so impatient. But now his pity, with his life, was wearing thin, and the dread almost amounting to horror, was rising into being. But before the armor of his pity really broke, he would die, as an insect when its shell is cracked. This was his final resource. Others would live on, and know the living death, the ensuing process of hopeless chaos. He would not. He denied death its victory. He had been so constant to his lights, so constant to charity, and to his love for his neighbor. Perhaps he had loved his neighbor even better than himself, which is going one further than the commandment. Always, this flame had burned in his heart, sustaining him through everything. The welfare of the people. He was a large employer of labor, he was a great mine owner. And he had never lost this from his heart, that in Christ he was one with his workmen. Nay, he had felt inferior to them, as if they through poverty and labor were nearer to God than he. He had always the unacknowledged belief, that it was his workmen, the miners, who held in their hands the means of salvation. To move nearer to God, he must move towards his miners. His life must gravitate towards theirs. They were, unconsciously, his idol, his God made manifest. In them he worshipped the highest, the great, sympathetic, mindless Godhead of humanity. And all the while, his wife had opposed him like one of the great demons of hell. Strange, like a bird of prey, with the fascinating beauty and abstraction of a hawk, she had beat against the bars of his philanthropy, and like a hawk in a cage, she had sunk into silence. By force of circumstance, because all the world combined to make the cage unbreakable, he had been too strong for her, he had kept her prisoner. And because she was his prisoner, his passion for her had always remained keen as death. He had always loved her with intensity. Within the cage, she was denied nothing, she was given all license. But she had gone almost mad. Of wild and overweening temper, she could not bear the humiliation of her husband's soft, half-appealing kindness to everybody. He was not deceived by the poor. He knew they came and sponged on him, and whined to him. The worst sort, the majority, luckily for him, were much too proud to ask for anything, much too independent to come knocking at his door. But in Beldover, as everywhere else, there were the whining, parasitic, foul human beings who come crawling after charity, and feeding on the living body of the public like lice. A kind of fire would go over Christiana Crich's brain, as she saw two more pale-faced, creeping women in objectionable black clothes, cringing lugubriously out the drive to the door. She wanted to set the dogs on them. Hire up. Hiring. Ranger. At 'em boys, set 'em off. But Crowther, the butler, with all the rest of the servants, was Mr. Crich's man. Nevertheless, when her husband was away, she would come down like a wolf on the crawling supplicants. What do you people want? There is nothing for you here. You have no business on the drive at all. Simpson, drive them away and let no more of them through the gate. The servants had to obey her. And she would stand watching with an eye like the eagle's, whilst the groom in clumsy confusion drove the lugubrious persons down the drive, as if they were rusty fowls, scuttling before him. But they learned to know, from the lodge-keeper, when Mrs. Crich was away, and they timed their visits. How many times, in the first years, would Crowther knock softly at the door, "Person to see you, sir." "What name?" "Grockock, sir." "What do they want?" The question was half impatient, half gratified. He liked hearing appeals to his charity. "About a child, sir." "Show them into the library, and tell them they shouldn't come after 11 o'clock in the morning." "Why do you get up from dinner?" "Send them off," his wife would say abruptly. "Oh, I can't do that. It's no trouble just to hear what they have to say. How many more have been here today? Why don't you establish open house for them? They would soon oust me and the children. You know, dear, it doesn't hurt me to hear what they have to say. And if they really are in trouble, well, It is my duty to help them out of it. It's your duty to invite all the rats in the world to gnaw at your bones. Come, Christiana, it isn't like that. Don't be uncharitable." But she suddenly swept out of the room, and out to the study. There sat the meager charity seekers, looking as if they were at the doctor's. "Mr. Crich can't see you. He can't see you at this hour. Do you think he is your property, that you can come whenever you like? You must go away, there is nothing for you here." The poor people rose in confusion. But Mr. Crich, pale and black-bearded and deprecating, came behind her, saying, "Yes, I don't like you coming as late as this. I'll hear any of you in the morning part of the day, but I can't really do with you after. What's amiss then, Giddens? How is your missus?" "Why, she's sunk very low, Mr. Crich, she's a'most gone, she is." Sometimes, it seemed to Mrs. Crich as if her husband were some subtle funeral bird, feeding on the miseries of the people. It seemed to her he was never satisfied unless there was some sordid tale being poured out to him, which he drank in with a sort of mournful, sympathetic satisfaction. He would have no raison d'etre if there were no lugubrious miseries in the world, as an undertaker would have no meaning if there were no funerals. Mrs. Crich recoiled back upon herself, she recoiled away from this world of creeping democracy. A band of tight, baleful exclusion fastened round her heart, her isolation was fierce and hard, her antagonism was passive but terribly pure, like that of a hawk in a cage. As the years went on, she lost more and more count of the world, she seemed wrapped in some glittering abstraction, almost purely unconscious. She would wander about the house and about the surrounding country, staring keenly and seeing nothing. She rarely spoke, she had no connection with the world. And she did not even think. She was consumed in a fierce tension of opposition, like the negative pole of a magnet. And she bore many children. For, as time went on, she never opposed her husband in word or deed. She took no notice of him, externally. She submitted to him, let him take what he wanted and do as he wanted with her. She was like a hawk that sullenly submits to everything. The relation between her and her husband was wordless and unknown, but it was deep, awful, a relation of utter interdestruction. And he, who triumphed in the world, he became more and more hollow in his vitality, the vitality was bled from within him, as by some hemorrhage. She was hulked like a hawk in a cage, but her heart was fierce and undiminished within her, though her mind was destroyed. So to the last he would go to her and hold her in his arms sometimes, before his strength was all gone. The terrible white, destructive light that burned in her eyes only excited and roused him. Till he was bled to death, and then he dreaded her more than anything. But he always said to himself, how happy he had been, how he had loved her with a pure and consuming love ever since he had known her. And he thought of her as pure, chaste, the white flame which was known to him alone, the flame of her sex, was a white flower of snow to his mind. She was a wonderful white snow flower, which he had desired infinitely. And now he was dying with all his ideas and interpretations intact. They would only collapse when the breath left his body. Till then they would be pure truths for him. Only death would show the perfect completeness of the lie. Till death, she was his white snow flower. He had subdued her, and her subjugation was to him an infinite chastity in her, a virginity which he could never break, and which dominated him as by a spell. She had let go the outer world, but within herself she was unbroken and unimpaired. She only sat in her room like a moping, disheveled hawk, motionless, mindless. Her children, for whom she had been so fierce in her youth, now meant scarcely anything to her. She had lost all that, she was quite by herself. Only Gerald, the gleaming, had some existence for her. But of late years, since he had become head of the business, he too was forgotten. Whereas the father, now he was dying, turned for compassion to Gerald. There had always been opposition between the two of them. Gerald had feared and despised his father, and to a great extent had avoided him all through boyhood and young manhood. And the father had felt very often a real dislike of his eldest son, which, never wanting to give way to, he had refused to acknowledge. He had ignored Gerald as much as possible, leaving him alone. Since, however, Gerald had come home and assumed responsibility in the firm, and had proved such a wonderful director, the father, tired and weary of all outside concerns, had put all his trust of these things in his son, implicitly, leaving everything to him, and assuming a rather touching dependence on the young enemy. This immediately roused a poignant pity and allegiance in Gerald's heart, always shadowed by contempt and by unadmitted enmity. For Gerald was in reaction against charity, and yet he was dominated by it. It assumed supremacy in the inner life, and he could not confute it. So he was partly subject to that which his father stood for, but he was in reaction against it. Now he could not save himself. A certain pity and grief and tenderness for his father overcame him, in spite of the deeper, more sullen hostility. The father won shelter from Gerald through compassion. But for love he had Winifred. She was his youngest child, she was the only one of his children whom he had ever closely loved. And her he loved with all the great, overweening, sheltering love of a dying man. He wanted to shelter her infinitely, to wrap her in warmth and love and shelter, perfectly. If he could save her she should never know one pain, one grief, one hurt. He had been so right all his life, so constant in his kindness and his goodness. And this was his last passionate righteousness, his love for the child Winifred. Some things troubled him yet. The world had passed away from him, as his strength ebbed. There were no more poor and injured and humble to protect and succor. These were all lost to him. There were no more sons and daughters to trouble him, and to weigh on him as an unnatural responsibility. These too had faded out of reality. All these things had fallen out of his hands, and left him free. There remained the covert fear and horror of his wife, as she sat mindless and strange in her room, or as she came forth with slow, prowling step, her head bent forward. But this he put away. Even his lifelong righteousness, however, would not quite deliver him from the inner horror. Still, he could keep it sufficiently at bay. It would never break forth openly. Death would come first. Then there was Winifred. If only he could be sure about her, if only he could be sure. Since the death of Diana, and the development of his illness, his craving for surety with regard to Winifred amounted almost to obsession. It was as if, even dying, he must have some anxiety, some responsibility of love, of charity, upon his heart. She was an odd, sensitive, inflammable child, having her father's dark hair and quiet bearing, but being quite detached, momentaneous. She was like a changeling indeed, as if her feelings did not matter to her, really. She often seemed to be talking and playing like the gayest and most childish of children. She was full of the warmest, most delightful affection for a few things, for her father, and for her animals in particular. But if she heard that her beloved kitten Leo had been run over by the motor car, she put her head on one side, and replied, with a faint contraction like resentment on her face, "Has he?" Then she took no more notice. She only disliked the servant who would force bad news on her, and wanted her to be sorry. She wished not to know, and that seemed her chief motive. She avoided her mother, and most of the members of her family. She loved her daddy, because he wanted her always to be happy, and because he seemed to become young again, and irresponsible in her presence. She liked Gerald, because he was so self-contained. She loved people who would make life a game for her. She had an amazing instinctive critical faculty, and was a pure anarchist, a pure aristocrat at once. For she accepted her equals wherever she found them, and she ignored with blithe indifference her inferiors, whether they were her brothers and sisters, or whether they were wealthy guests of the house, or whether they were the common people or the servants. She was quite single and by herself, deriving from nobody. It was as if she were cut off from all purpose or continuity, and existed simply moment by moment. The father, as by some strange final illusion, felt as if all his fate depended on his ensuring to Winifred her happiness. She who could never suffer, because she never formed vital connections, she who could lose the dearest things of her life and be just the same the next day, the whole memory dropped out, as if deliberately, she whose will was so strangely and easily free, anarchistic, almost nihilistic, who like a soulless bird flits on its own will, without attachment or responsibility beyond the moment, who in her every motion snapped the threads of serious relationship with blithe, free hands, really nihilistic, because never troubled, she must be the object of her father's final passionate solicitude. When Mr. Crich heard that Gudrun Brangwen might come to help Winifred with her drawing and modeling, he saw a road to salvation for his child. He believed that Winifred had talent, he had seen Gudrun, he knew that she was an exceptional person. He could give Winifred into her hands as into the hands of a right being. Here was a direction and a positive force to be lent to his child, he need not leave her directionless and defenseless. If he could but graft the girl onto some tree of utterance before he died, he would have fulfilled his responsibility. And here it could be done. He did not hesitate to appeal to Gudrun. Meanwhile, as the father drifted more and more out of life, Gerald experienced more and more a sense of exposure. His father after all had stood for the living world to him. Whilst his father lived, Gerald was not responsible for the world. But now his father was passing away, Gerald found himself left exposed and unready before the storm of living, like the mutinous first mate of a ship that has lost his captain, and who sees only a terrible chaos in front of him. He did not inherit an established order and a living idea. The whole unifying idea of mankind seemed to be dying with his father, the centralizing force that had held the whole together seemed to collapse with his father, the parts were ready to go asunder in terrible disintegration. Gerald was as if left on board of a ship that was going asunder beneath his feet, he was in charge of a vessel whose timbers were all coming apart. He knew that all his life he had been wrenching at the frame of life to break it apart. And now, with something of the terror of a destructive child, he saw himself on the point of inheriting his own destruction. And during the last months, under the influence of death, and of Birkin's talk, and of Gudrun's penetrating being, he had lost entirely that mechanical certainty that had been his triumph. Sometimes spasms of hatred came over him, against Birkin and Gudrun and that whole set. He wanted to go back to the dullest conservatism, to the most stupid of conventional people. He wanted to revert to the strictest Toryism. But the desire did not last long enough to carry him into action. During his childhood and his boyhood he had wanted a sort of savagedom. The days of Homer were his ideal, when a man was chief of an army of heroes, or spent his years in wonderful odyssey. He hated remorselessly the circumstances of his own life, so much that he never really saw Beldover and the Colliery Valley. He turned his face entirely away from the blackened mining region that stretched away on the right hand of Shortlands, he turned entirely to the country and the woods beyond Willy Water. It was true that the panting and rattling of the coal mines could always be heard at Shortlands. But from his earliest childhood, Gerald had paid no heed to this. He had ignored the whole of the industrial sea which surged in coal-blackened tides against the grounds of the house. The world was really a wilderness where one hunted and swam and rode. He rebelled against all authority. Life was a condition of savage freedom. Then he had been sent away to school, which was so much death to him. He refused to go to Oxford, choosing a German university. He had spent a certain time at Bonn, at Berlin, and at Frankfurt. There, a curiosity had been aroused in his mind. He wanted to see and to know, in a curious objective fashion, as if it were an amusement to him. Then he must try war. Then he must travel into the savage regions that had so attracted him. The result was, he found humanity very much alike everywhere, and to a mind like his, curious and cold, the savage was duller, less exciting than the European. So he took hold of all kinds of sociological ideas, and ideas of reform. But they never went more than skin deep, they were never more than a mental amusement. Their interest lay chiefly in the reaction against the positive order, the destructive reaction. He discovered at last a real adventure in the coal mines. His father asked him to help in the firm. Gerald had been educated in the science of mining, and it had never interested him. Now, suddenly, with a sort of exultation, he laid hold of the world. There was impressed photographically on his consciousness the great industry. Suddenly, it was real, he was part of it. Down the valley ran the colliery railway, linking mine with mine. Down the railway ran the trains, short trains of heavily laden trucks, long trains of empty wagons, each one bearing in big white letters the initials, C.B. and Co. These white letters on all the wagons he had seen since his first childhood, and it was as if he had never seen them, they were so familiar, and so ignored. Now at last he saw his own name written on the wall. Now he had a vision of power. So many wagons, bearing his initial, running all over the country. He saw them as he entered London in the train, he saw them at Dover. So far his power ramified. He looked at Beldover, at Selby, at Watmore, at Liffley Bank, the great colliery villages which depended entirely on his mines. They were hideous and sordid, during his childhood they had been sores in his consciousness. And now he saw them with pride. 4 raw new towns, and many ugly industrial hamlets were crowded under his dependence. He saw the stream of miners flowing along the causeways from the mines at the end of the afternoon, thousands of blackened, slightly distorted human beings with red mouths, all moving subjugate to his will. He pushed slowly in his motor car through the little market top on Friday nights in Beldover, through a solid mass of human beings that were making their purchases and doing their weekly spending. They were all subordinate to him. They were ugly and uncouth, but they were his instruments. He was the god of the machine. They made way for his motor car automatically, slowly. He did not care whether they made way with alacrity, or grudgingly. He did not care what they thought of him. His vision had suddenly crystallized. Suddenly he had conceived the pure instrumentality of mankind. There had been so much humanitarianism, so much talk of sufferings and feelings. It was ridiculous. The sufferings and feelings of individuals did not matter in the least. They were mere conditions, like the weather. What mattered was the pure instrumentality of the individual. As a man as of a knife, does it cut well? Nothing else mattered. Everything in the world has its function, and is good or not good insofar as it fulfills this function more or less perfectly. Was a miner a good miner? Then he was complete. Was a manager a good manager? That was enough. Gerald himself, who was responsible for all this industry, was he a good director? If he were, he had fulfilled his life. The rest was by play. The mines were there, they were old. They were giving out, it did not pay to work the seams. There was talk of closing down 2 of them. It was at this point that Gerald arrived on the scene. He looked around. There lay the mines. They were old, obsolete. They were like old lions, no more good. He looked again. Bah! The mines were nothing but the clumsy efforts of impure minds. There they lay, abortions of a half-trained mind. Let the idea of them be swept away. He cleared his brain of them, and thought only of the coal in the under-earth. How much was there? There was plenty of coal. The old workings could not get at it, that was all. Then break the neck of the old workings. The coal lay there in its seams, even though the seams were thin. There it lay, inert matter, as it had always lain, since the beginning of time, subject to the will of man. The will of man was the determining factor. Man was the arch-god of earth. His mind was obedient to serve his will. Man's will was the absolute, the only absolute. And it was his will to subjugate matter to his own ends. The subjugation itself was the point, the fight was the be-all, the fruits of victory were mere results. It was not for the sake of money that Gerald took over the mines. He did not care about money, fundamentally. He was neither ostentatious nor luxurious, neither did he care about social position, not finally. What he wanted was the pure fulfillment of his own will in the struggle with the natural conditions. His will was now, to take the coal out of the earth, profitably. The profit was merely the condition of victory, but the victory itself lay in the feat achieved. He vibrated with zest before the challenge. Every day he was in the mines, examining, testing, he consulted experts, he gradually gathered the whole situation into his mind, as a general grasps the plan of his campaign. Then there was need for a complete break. The mines were run on an old system, an obsolete idea. The initial idea had been to obtain as much money from the earth as would make the owners comfortably rich, would allow the workmen sufficient wages and good conditions, and would increase the wealth of the country altogether. Gerald's father, following in the second generation, having a sufficient fortune, had thought only of the men. The mines, for him, were primarily great fields to produce bread and plenty for all the hundreds of human beings gathered about them. He had lived and striven with his fellow owners to benefit the men every time. And the men had been benefited in their fashion. There were few poor, and few needy. All was plenty, because the mines were good and easy to work. And the miners, in those days, finding themselves richer than they might have expected, felt glad and triumphant. They thought themselves well off, they congratulated themselves on their good fortune, they remembered how their fathers had starved and suffered, and they felt that better times had come. They were grateful to those others, the pioneers, the new owners, who had opened out the pits, and let forth this stream of plenty. But man is never satisfied, and so the miners, from gratitude to their owners, passed on to murmuring. Their sufficiency decreased with knowledge, they wanted more. Why should the master be so out of all proportion rich? There was a crisis when Gerald was a boy, when the Masters' Federation closed down the mines because the men would not accept a reduction. This lockout had forced home the new conditions to Thomas Crich. Belonging to the Federation, he had been compelled by his honor to close the pits against his men. He, the father, the patriarch, was forced to deny the means of life to his sons, his people. He, the rich man who would hardly enter heaven because of his possessions, must now turn upon the poor, upon those who were nearer Christ than himself, those who were humble and despised and closer to perfection, those who were manly and noble in their labors, and must say to them, "Ye shall neither labor nor eat bread." It was this recognition of the state of war which really broke his heart. He wanted his industry to be run on love. Oh, he wanted love to be the directing power even of the mines. And now, from under the cloak of love, the sword was cynically drawn, the sword of mechanical necessity. This really broke his heart. He must have the illusion, and now the illusion was destroyed. The men were not against him, but they were against the masters. It was war, and willy-nilly he found himself on the wrong side, in his own conscience. Seething masses of miners met daily, carried away by a new religious impulse. The idea flew through them, all men are equal on earth, and they would carry the idea to its material fulfillment. After all, is it not the teaching of Christ? And what is an idea, if not the germ of action in the material world? All men are equal in spirit, they are all sons of God. Whence then this obvious disquality? It was a religious creed pushed to its material conclusion. Thomas Crich at least had no answer. He could but admit, according to his sincere tenets, that the disquality was wrong. But he could not give up his goods, which were the stuff of disquality. So the men would fight for their rights. The last impulses of the last religious passion left on earth, the passion for equality, inspired them. Seething mobs of men marched about, their faces lighted up as for holy war, with a smoke of cupidity. How disentangle the passion for equality from the passion of cupidity, when begins the fight for equality of possessions? But the God was the machine. Each man claimed equality in the Godhead of the great productive machine. Every man equally was part of this Godhead. But somehow, somewhere, Thomas Crich knew this was false. When the machine is the Godhead, and production or work is worship, then the most mechanical mind is purest and highest, the representative of God on earth. And the rest are subordinate, each according to his degree. Riots broke out, Watmore Pit Head was in flames. This was the pit furthest in the country, near the woods. Soldiers came. From the windows of Shortlands, on that fatal day, could be seen the flare of fire in the sky not far off, and now the little colliery train, with the workmen's carriages which were used to convey the miners to the distant Watmore, was crossing the valley full of soldiers, full of red coats. Then there was the far-off sound of firing, Then the later news that the mob was dispersed, one man was shot dead, the fire was put out. Gerald, who was a boy, was filled with the wildest excitement and delight. He longed to go with the soldiers to shoot the men. But he was not allowed to go out of the lodge gates. At the gates were stationed sentries with guns. Gerald stood near them in delight, whilst gangs of derisive miners strolled up and down the lanes, calling and jeering, "Now then, 3 ha'porth coppers, let's see thee shoot thy gun." Insults were chalked on the walls and the fences, the servants left. And all this while Thomas Crich was breaking his heart, and giving away hundreds of pounds in charity. Everywhere there was free food, a surfeit of free food. Anybody could have bread for asking, and a loaf cost only 3 halfpence. Every day there was a free tea somewhere. The children had never had so many treats in their lives. On Friday afternoon great basketfuls of buns and cakes were taken into the schools, and great pitchers of milk. The school children had what they wanted. They were sick with eating too much cake and milk. And then it came to an end, and the men went back to work. But it was never the same as before. There was a new situation created, a new idea reigned. Even in the machine, there should be equality. No part should be subordinate to any other part, all should be equal. The instinct for chaos had entered. Mystic equality lies in abstraction, not in having or in doing, which are processes. In function and process, one man, one part, must of necessity be subordinate to another. It is a condition of being. But the desire for chaos had risen, and the idea of mechanical equality was the weapon of disruption which should execute the will of man, the will for chaos. Gerald was a boy at the time of the strike, but he longed to be a man, to fight the colliers. The father, however, was trapped between 2 half-truths, and broken. He wanted to be a pure Christian, one and equal with all men. He even wanted to give away all he had, to the poor. Yet he was a great promoter of industry, and he knew perfectly that he must keep his goods and keep his authority. This was as divine a necessity in him, as the need to give away all he possessed, more divine, even, since this was the necessity he acted upon. Yet because he did not act on the other ideal, it dominated him, he was dying of chagrin because he must forfeit it. He wanted to be a father of loving kindness and sacrificial benevolence. The colliers shouted to him about his thousands a year. They would not be deceived. When Gerald grew up in the ways of the world, he shifted the position. He did not care about the equality. The whole Christian attitude of love and self-sacrifice was old hat. He knew that position and authority were the right thing in the world, and it was useless to cant about it. They were the right thing, for the simple reason that they were functionally necessary. They were not the be-all and the end-all. It was like being part of a machine. He himself happened to be a controlling, central part, the masses of men were the parts variously controlled. This was merely as it happened. As well get excited because a central hub drives 100 outer wheels or because the whole universe wheels round the sun. After all, it would be mere silliness to say that the Moon and the Earth and Saturn and Jupiter and Venus have just as much right to be the center of the universe, each of them separately, as the Sun. Such an assertion is made merely in the desire of chaos. Without bothering to think to a conclusion, Gerald jumped to a conclusion. He abandoned the whole democratic equality problem as a problem of silliness. What mattered was the great social productive machine. Let that work perfectly, let it produce a sufficiency of everything, let every man be given a rational portion, greater or less according to his functional degree or magnitude, and then, provision made, let the devil supervene, let every man look after his own amusements and appetites, so long as he interfered with nobody. So Gerald set himself to work, to put the great industry in order. In his travels, and in his accompanying readings, he had come to the conclusion that the essential secret of life was harmony. He did not define to himself at all clearly what harmony was. The word pleased him, he felt he had come to his own conclusions. And he proceeded to put his philosophy into practice by forcing order into the established world, translating the mystic word harmony into the practical word organization. Immediately he saw the firm, he realized what he could do. He had a fight to fight with matter, with the earth and the coal it enclosed. This was the sole idea, to turn upon the inanimate matter of the underground, and reduce it to his will. And for this fight with matter, one must have perfect instruments in perfect organization, a mechanism so subtle and harmonious in its workings that it represents the single mind of man, and by its relentless repetition of given movement, will accomplish a purpose irresistibly, inhumanly. It was this inhuman principle in the mechanism he wanted to construct that inspired Gerald with an almost religious exaltation. He, the man, could interpose a perfect, changeless, godlike medium between himself and the matter he had to subjugate. There were two opposites, his will and the resistant matter of the earth. And between these he could establish the very expression of his will, the incarnation of his power, a great and perfect machine, a system, an activity of pure order, pure mechanical repetition, repetition ad infinitum, hence eternal and infinite. He found his eternal and his infinite in the pure machine principle of perfect coordination into one pure, complex, infinitely repeated motion, like the spinning of a wheel, but a productive spinning, as the revolving of the universe may be called a productive spinning, a productive repetition through eternity, to infinity. And this is the God motion, this productive repetition ad infinitum. And Gerald was the god of the machine, Deus ex machina. And the whole productive will of man was the Godhead. He had his life work now, to extend over the earth a great and perfect system in which the will of man ran smooth and unthwarted, timeless, a Godhead in process. He had to begin with the mines. The terms were given, first the resistant matter of the underground, then the instruments of its subjugation, instruments human and metallic, and finally his own pure will, his own mind. It would need a marvelous adjustment of myriad instruments, human, animal, metallic, kinetic, dynamic, a marvelous casting of myriad tiny wholes into one great perfect entirety. And then, in this case there was perfection attained, the will of the highest was perfectly fulfilled, the will of mankind was perfectly enacted. For was not mankind mystically contradistinguished against inanimate matter? Was not the history of mankind just the history of the conquest of the one by the other? The miners were overreached. While they were still in the toils of divine equality of man, Gerald had passed on, granted essentially their case, and proceeded in his quality of human being to fulfill the will of mankind as a whole. He merely represented the miners in a higher sense when he perceived that the only way to fulfill perfectly the will of man was to establish the perfect, inhuman machine. But he represented them very essentially, they were far behind, out of date, squabbling for their material equality. The desire had already transmuted into this new and greater desire, for a perfect intervening mechanism between man and matter, the desire to translate the Godhead into pure mechanism. As soon as Gerald entered the firm, the convulsion of death ran through the old system. He had all his life been tortured by a furious and destructive demon, which possessed him sometimes like an insanity. This temper now entered like a virus into the firm, and there were cruel eruptions. Terrible and inhuman were his examinations into every detail, there was no privacy he would spare, no old sentiment but he would turn it over. The old grey managers, the old grey clerks, the doddering old pensioners, he looked at them, and removed them as so much lumber. The whole concern seemed like a hospital of invalid employees. He had no emotional qualms. He arranged what pensions were necessary, he looked for efficient substitutes, and when these were found, he substituted them for the old hands. "I've a pitiful letter here from Letherington," his father would say, in a tone of deprecation and appeal. "Don't you think the poor fellow might keep on a little longer? I always fancied he did very well. I've got a man in his place now, father. He'll be happier out of it, believe me. You think his allowance is plenty, don't you? It is not the allowance that he wants, poor man. He feels it very much, that he is superannuated. Says he thought he had 20 more years of work in him yet. Not of this kind of work I want. He doesn't understand." The father sighed. He wanted not to know any more. He believed the pits would have to be overhauled if they were to go on working. And after all, it would be worst in the long run for everybody, if they must close down. So he could make no answer to the appeals of his old and trusty servants, he could only repeat Gerald says. So the father drew more and more out of the light. The whole frame of the real life was broken for him. He had been right according to his lights. And his lights had been those of the great religion. Yet they seemed to have become obsolete, to be superseded in the world. He could not understand. He only withdrew with his lights into an inner room, into the silence. The beautiful candles of belief, that would not do to light the world any more, they would still burn sweetly and sufficiently in the inner room of his soul, and in the silence of his retirement. Gerald rushed into the reform of the firm, beginning with the office. It was needful to economize severely, to make possible the great alterations he must introduce. "What are these widows' coals?" he asked. "We have always allowed all widows of men who worked for the firm a load of coals every 3 months. They must pay cost price henceforward. The firm is not a charity institution, as everybody seems to think. Widows, these stock figures of sentimental humanitarianism," he felt a dislike at the thought of them. They were almost repulsive. Why were they not immolated on the pyre of the husband, like the suttee in India? At any rate, let them pay the cost of their coals. In 1,000 ways he cut down the expenditure, in ways so fine as to be hardly noticeable to the men. The miners must pay for the cartage of their coals, heavy cartage too. They must pay for their tools, for the sharpening, for the care of lamps, for the many trifling things that made the bill of charges against every man mount up to a shilling or so in the week. It was not grasped very definitely by the miners, though they were sore enough. But it saved hundreds of pounds every week for the firm. Gradually Gerald got hold of everything. And then began the great reform. Expert engineers were introduced in every department. An enormous electric plant was installed, both for lighting and for haulage underground, and for power. The electricity was carried into every mine. New machinery was brought from America, such as the miners had never seen before, great iron men, as the cutting machines were called, and unusual appliances. The working of the pits was thoroughly changed, all the control was taken out of the hands of the miners, the buddy system was abolished. Everything was run on the most accurate and delicate scientific method, educated and expert men were in control everywhere, the miners were reduced to mere mechanical instruments. They had to work hard, much harder than before, the work was terrible and heartbreaking in its mechanicalness. But they submitted to it all. The joy went out of their lives, the hope seemed to perish as they became more and more mechanized. And yet they accepted the new conditions. They even got a further satisfaction out of them. At first they hated Gerald Crich, they swore to do something to him, to murder him. But as time went on, they accepted everything with some fatal satisfaction. Gerald was their high priest, he represented the religion they really felt. His father was forgotten already. There was a new world, a new order, strict, terrible, inhuman, but satisfying in its very destructiveness. The men were satisfied to belong to the great and wonderful machine, even whilst it destroyed them. It was what they wanted. It was the highest that man had produced, the most wonderful and superhuman. They were exalted by belonging to this great and superhuman system which was beyond feeling or reason, something really godlike. Their hearts died within them, but their souls were satisfied. It was what they wanted. Otherwise Gerald could never have done what he did. He was just ahead of them in giving them what they wanted, this participation in a great and perfect system that subjected life to pure mathematical principles. This was a sort of freedom, the sort they really wanted. It was the first great step in undoing, the first great phase of chaos, the substitution of the mechanical principle for the organic, the destruction of the organic purpose, the organic unity, and the subordination of every organic unit to the great mechanical purpose. It was pure organic disintegration and pure mechanical organization. This is the first and finest state of chaos. Gerald was satisfied. He knew the colliers said they hated him. But he had long ceased to hate them. When they streamed past him at evening, Their heavy boots slurring on the pavement wearily, their shoulders slightly distorted, they took no notice of him, they gave him no greeting whatever, they passed in a grey-black stream of unemotional acceptance. They were not important to him, save as instruments, nor he to them, save as a supreme instrument of control. As minors they had their being, he had his being as director. He admired their qualities. But as men, personalities, they were just accidents, sporadic little unimportant phenomena. And tacitly, the men agreed to this. For Gerald agreed to it in himself. He had succeeded. He had converted the industry into a new and terrible purity. There was a greater output of coal than ever, the wonderful and delicate system ran almost perfectly. He had a set of really clever engineers, both mining and electrical, and they did not cost much. A highly educated man cost very little more than a workman. His managers, who were all rare men, were no more expensive than the old bungling fools of his father's days, who were merely colliers promoted. His chief manager, who had $1,200 a year, saved the firm at least $5,000. The whole system was now so perfect that Gerald was hardly necessary anymore. It was so perfect that sometimes a strange fear came over him, and he did not know what to do. He went on for some years in a sort of trance of activity. What he was doing seemed supreme, he was almost like a divinity. He was a pure and exalted activity. But now he had succeeded, he had finally succeeded. And once or twice lately, when he was alone in the evening and had nothing to do, he had suddenly stood up in terror, not knowing what he was. And he went to the mirror and looked long and closely at his own face, at his own eyes, seeking for something. He was afraid, in mortal dry fear, but he knew not what of. He looked at his own face. There it was, shapely and healthy and the same as ever, yet somehow, it was not real, it was a mask. He dared not touch it, for fear it should prove to be only a composition mask. His eyes were blue and keen as ever, and as firm in their sockets. Yet he was not sure that they were not blue false bubbles that would burst in a moment and leave clear annihilation. He could see the darkness in them, as if they were only bubbles of darkness. He was afraid that one day he would break down and be a purely meaningless babble lapping round a darkness. But his will yet held good, he was able to go away and read, and think about things. He liked to read books about the primitive man, books of anthropology, and also works of speculative philosophy. His mind was very active. But it was like a bubble floating in the darkness. At any moment it might burst and leave him in chaos. He would not die. He knew that. He would go on living, but the meaning would have collapsed out of him, his divine reason would be gone. In a strangely indifferent, sterile way, he was frightened. But he could not react even to the fear. It was as if his centers of feeling were drying up. He remained calm, calculative and healthy, and quite freely deliberate, even whilst he felt, with faint, small but final sterile horror, that his mystic reason was breaking, giving way now, at this crisis. And it was a strain. He knew there was no equilibrium. He would have to go in some direction, shortly, to find relief. Only Birkin kept the fear definitely off him, saved him his quick sufficiency in life, by the odd mobility and changeableness which seemed to contain the quintessence of faith. But then Gerald must always come away from Birkin, as from a church service, back to the outside real world of work and life. There it was, it did not alter, and words were futilities. He had to keep himself in reckoning with the world of work and material life. And it became more and more difficult, such a strange pressure was upon him, as if the very middle of him were a vacuum, and outside were an awful tension. He had found his most satisfactory relief in women. After a debauch with some desperate woman, he went on quite easy and forgetful. The devil of it was so hard to keep up his interest in women nowadays. He didn't care about them anymore. A pussum was all right in her way, but she was an exceptional case, and even she mattered extremely little. No, women, in that sense, were useless to him anymore. He felt that his mind needed acute stimulation, before he could be physically roused. Chapter 18. Rabbit. Gudrun knew that it was a critical thing for her to go to Shortlands. She knew it was equivalent to accepting Gerald Crich as a lover. And though she hung back, disliking the condition, yet she knew she would go on. She equivocated. She said to herself, in torment recalling the blow and the kiss, after all, what is it? What is a kiss? What even is a blow? It is an instant, vanished at once. I can go to Shortlands just for a time, before I go away, if only to see what it is like. For she had an insatiable curiosity to see and to know everything. She also wanted to know what Winifred was really like. Having heard the child calling from the steamer in the night, she felt some mysterious connection with her. Gudrun talked with the father in the library. Then he sent for his daughter. She came accompanied by Mademoiselle. Winnie, this is Miss Brangwen, who will be so kind as to help you with your drawing and making models of your animals, said the father. The child looked at Gudrun for a moment with interest, before she came forward and with face averted offered her hand. There was a complete sang-froid and indifference under Winifred's childish reserve, a certain irresponsible callousness. "How do you do?" said the child, not lifting her face. "How do you do?" said Gudrun. Then Winifred stood aside, and Gudrun was introduced to Mademoiselle. "You have a fine day for your walk," said Mademoiselle, in a bright manner. "Quite fine," said Gudrun. Winifred was watching from her distance. She was as if amused, but rather unsure as yet what this new person was like. She saw so many new persons, and so few who became real to her. Mademoiselle was of no count whatever, the child merely put up with her, calmly and easily, accepting her little authority with faint scorn, compliant out of childish arrogance of indifference. "Well, Winifred," said the father, "aren't you glad Miss Brangwen has come? She makes animals and birds in wood and in clay, that the people in London write about in the papers, praising them to the skies." Winifred smiled slightly. "Who told you, Daddy?" she asked. "Who told me? Hermione told me, and Rupert Birkin. Do you know them?" Winifred asked of Gudrun, turning to her with faint challenge. "Yes," said Gudrun. Winifred readjusted herself a little. She had been ready to accept Gudrun as a sort of servant. Now she saw it was on terms of friendship they were intended to meet. She was rather glad. She had so many half-inferiors, whom she tolerated with perfect good humor. Gudrun was very calm. She also did not take these things very seriously. A new occasion was mostly spectacular to her. However, Winifred was a detached, ironic child, she would never attach herself. Gudrun liked her and was intrigued by her. The first meetings went off with a certain humiliating clumsiness. Neither Winifred nor her instructress had any social grace. Soon, however, they met in a kind of make-believe world. Winifred did not notice human beings unless they were like herself, playful and slightly mocking. She would accept nothing but the world of amusement, and the serious people of her life were the animals she had for pets. On those she lavished, almost ironically, her affection and her companionship. To the rest of the human scheme she submitted with a faint bored indifference. She had a Pekingese dog called Lalo, which she loved. "Let us draw Lalo," said Gudrun, "and see if we can get his luliness, shall we?" "Darling!" cried Winifred, rushing to the dog, that sat with contemplative sadness on the hearth, and kissing its bulging brow. "Darling one, will you be drawn? Shall its mummy draw its portrait?" Then she chuckled gleefully, and turning to Gudrun, said, "Oh let's." They proceeded to get pencils and paper, and were ready. "Beautifulest," cried Winifred, hugging the dog, "sit still while its mummy draws its beautiful portrait." The dog looked up at her with grievous resignation in its large, prominent eyes. She kissed it fervently, and said, "I wonder what mine will be like. It's sure to be awful." As she sketched she chuckled to herself, and cried out at times, "Oh darling, you're so beautiful." And again chuckling, she rushed to embrace the dog, in penitence, as if she were doing him some subtle injury. He sat all the time with the resignation and fretfulness of ages on his dark velvety face. She drew slowly, with a wicked concentration in her eyes, her head on one side, an intense stillness over her. She was as if working the spell of some enchantment. Suddenly she had finished. She looked at the dog, and then at her drawing, and then cried, with real grief for the dog, and at the same time with a wicked exultation, "My beautiful, why did they?" She took her paper to the dog, and held it under his nose. He turned his head aside as in chagrin and mortification, and she impulsively kissed his velvety bulging forehead. "Saluli, a little Lucy. Look at his portrait, darling, look at his portrait, that his mother has done of him." She looked at her paper and chuckled. Then, kissing the dog once more, she rose and came gravely to Gudrun, offering her the paper. It was a grotesque little diagram of a grotesque little animal, so wicked and so comical. A slow smile came over Gudrun's face, unconsciously. And at her side Winifred chuckled with glee, and said, "It isn't like him, is it? He's much lovelier than that. He's so beautiful, Lolo, my sweet darling." And she flew off to embrace the chagrined little dog. He looked up at her with reproachful, saturnine eyes, vanquished in his extreme agedness of being. Then she flew back to her drawing, and chuckled with satisfaction. "It isn't like him, is it?" she said to Gudrun. "Yes, it's very like him," Gudrun replied. The child treasured her drawing, carried it about with her, and showed it, with a silent embarrassment, to everybody. "Look," she said, thrusting the paper into her father's hand. "Why, that's Lolo!" he exclaimed. And he looked down in surprise, hearing the almost inhuman chuckle of the child at his side. Gerald was away from home when Gudrun first came to Shortlands. But the first morning he came back he watched for her. It was a sunny, soft morning, and he lingered in the garden paths, looking at the flowers that had come out during his absence. He was clean and fit as ever, shaven, his fair hair scrupulously parted at the side, bright in the sunshine, his short, fair mustache closely clipped, his eyes with their humorous kind twinkle, which was so deceptive. He was dressed in black, his clothes sat well on his well-nourished body. Yet as he lingered before the flower beds in the morning sunshine, there was a certain isolation, a fear about him, as of something wanting. Gudrun came up quickly, unseen. She was dressed in blue, with woolen yellow stockings, like the Bluecoat boys. He glanced up in surprise. Her stockings always disconcerted him, the pale yellow stockings and the heavy black shoes. Winifred, who had been playing about the garden with Mademoiselle and the dogs, came flitting towards Gudrun. The child wore a dress of black and white stripes. Her hair was rather short, cut round and hanging level in her neck. "We're going to do Bismarck, aren't we?" she said, linking her hand through Gudrun's arm. "Yes, we're going to do Bismarck. Do you want to?" "Oh yes, so I do. I want most awfully to do Bismarck. He looks so splendid this morning, so fierce. He's almost as big as a lion." And the child chuckled sardonically at her own hyperbole. "He's a real king, he really is." "Bonjour, mademoiselle," said the little French governess, wavering up with a slight bow, a bow of the sort that Gudrun loathed, insolent. "Winifred veut tant faire le portrait de Bismarck." "Oh, mais tout la matinée we will do Bismarck this morning!" Bismarck, Bismarck, toujours Bismarck. "C'est un lapin, n'est-ce pas, mademoiselle?" "Oui, c'est un grand lapin blanc et noir." "Vous n'y l'avez pas vu?" said Gudrun in her good, but rather heavy French. "Non, mademoiselle, Winifred n'a jamais vu la faire voir. Tant de fois je la lui I demand, qu'est-ce case Bismarck, Winifred? Mais elle n'a pas voulu la dire. Son Bismarck, qu'était un mystère." "Oui, c'est un mystère, vraiment un mystère." "Miss Brangwen, say that Bismarck is a mystery," cried Winifred. "Bismarck is a mystery, Bismarck, c'est un mystère, der Bismarck, ist ein Wunder," said Gudrun, in mocking incantation. "Ja, ist ein Wunder," repeated Winifred, with odd seriousness, under which lay a wicked chuckle. "First her ein Wunder?" came the slightly insolent sneering of Mademoiselle. "Doc," said Winifred briefly, indifferent. Doch ist nicht ein König. Bismarck, he was not a king, Winifred, as you have said. He was only alienated Chancellor. Quist one Chancellor? Said Winifred, with slightly contemptuous indifference. A Chancellor is a Chancellor, and a Chancellor is, I believe, a sort of judge, said Gerald, coming up and shaking hands with Gudrun. You'll have made a song of Bismarck soon, said he. Mademoiselle waited, and discreetly made her inclination, and her greeting. So they wouldn't let you see Bismarck, Mademoiselle? He said. Non, monsieur. Eh, very mean of them. What are you going to do to him, Miss Brangwen? I want him sent to the kitchen and cooked. Oh no, cried Winifred. We are going to draw him, said Gudrun. Draw him and quarter him and dish him up, he said, being purposely fatuous. Oh no, cried Winifred with emphasis, chuckling. Gudrun detected the tang of mockery in him, and she looked up and smiled into his face. He felt his nerves caressed. Their eyes met in knowledge. How do you like short lads? He asked. Oh, very much, she said, with nonchalance. Glad you do. Have you noticed these flowers? He led her along the path. She followed intently. Winifred came, and the governess lingered in the rear. They stopped before some vain salpiglossus flowers. Aren't they wonderful? She cried, looking at them absorbedly. Strange how her reverential, almost ecstatic admiration of the flowers caressed his nerves. She stooped down, and touched the trumpets, with infinitely fine and delicate touching fingertips. It filled him with ease to see her. When she rose, her eyes, hot with the beauty of the flowers, looked into his. What are they? She asked. Sort of petunia, I suppose, he answered. I don't really know them. They are quite strangers to me, she said. They stood together in a false intimacy, a nervous contact. And he was in love with her. She was aware of Mademoiselle standing near, like a little French beetle, observant and calculating. She moved away with Winifred, saying they would go to find Bismarck. Gerald watched them go, looking all the while at the soft, full, still body of Gudrun, in its silky cashmere. How silky and rich and soft her body must be! An excess of appreciation came over his mind. She was the all-desirable, the all-beautiful. He wanted only to come to her, nothing more. He was only this being that should come to her, and be given to her. At the same time he was finely and acutely aware of Mademoiselle's neat, brittle finality of form. She was like some elegant beetle with thin ankles, perched on her high heels, her glossy black dress perfectly correct, her dark hair done high and admirably. How repulsive her completeness and her finality was. He loathed her. Yet he did admire her. She was perfectly correct. And it did rather annoy him that Gudrun came dressed in startling colors, like a macaw, when the family was in mourning. Like a macaw she was. He watched the lingering way she took her feet from the ground. And her ankles were pale yellow, and her dress a deep blue. Yet it pleased him. It pleased him very much. He felt the challenge in her very attire. She challenged the whole world. And he smiled as to the note of a trumpet. Gudrun and Winifred went through the house to the back, where were the stables and the outbuildings. Everywhere was still and deserted. Mr. Crich had gone out for a short drive, the stableman had just led round Gerald's horse. The two girls went to the hutch that stood in a corner, and looked at the great black and white rabbit. Isn't he beautiful? Oh, do look at him listening. Doesn't he look silly? She laughed quickly, then added, oh, do let's do him listening, do let us, he listens with so much of himself don't you darling Bismarck? Can we take him out? Said Gudrun. He's very strong. He really is extremely strong. She looked at Gudrun, her head on one side, in odd calculating mistrust. But we'll try, shall we? Yes, if you like. But he's a fearful kicker. They took the key to unlock the door. The rabbit exploded in a wild rush round the hutch. He scratches most awfully sometimes, cried Winifred in excitement. Oh, do look at him, isn't he wonderful? The rabbit tore round the hutch in a hurry. Bismarck!" cried the child, in rousing excitement. "How dreadful you are! You are beastly." Winifred looked up at Gudrun with some misgiving in her wild excitement. Gudrun smiled sardonically with her mouth. Winifred made a strange crooning noise of unaccountable excitement. "Now he's still," she cried, seeing the rabbit settled down in a far corner of the hutch. "Shall we take him now?" she whispered excitedly, mysteriously, looking up at Gudrun and edging very close. "Shall we get him now?" She chuckled wickedly to herself. They unlocked the door of the hutch. Gudrun thrust in her arm and seized the great, lusty rabbit. As it crouched still, she grasped its long ears. It set its 4 feet flat, and thrust back. There was a long scraping sound as it was hauled forward, and in another instant it was in midair, lunging wildly, its body flying like a spring coiled and released, as it lashed out, suspended from the ears. Gudrun held the black and white tempest at arm's length, averting her face. But the rabbit was magically strong, it was all she could do to keep her grasp. She almost lost her presence of mind. "Bismarck, Bismarck, you are behaving terribly," said Winifred in a rather frightened voice. "Oh, do put him down, he's beastly." Gudrun stood for a moment astounded by the thunderstorm that had sprung into being in her grip. Then her color came up, a heavy rage came over her like a cloud. She stood shaken as a house in a storm, and utterly overcome. Her heart was arrested with fury at the mindlessness and the bestial stupidity of this struggle. Her wrists were badly scored by the claws of the beast, a heavy cruelty welled up in her. Gerald came round as she was trying to capture the flying rabbit under her arm. He saw, with subtle recognition, her sullen passion of cruelty. "You should let one of the men do that for you," he said, hurrying up. "Oh, he's so horrid!" cried Winifred, almost frantic. He held out his nervous, sinewy hand and took the rabbit by the ears, from Gudrun. "It's most fearfully strong," she cried, in a high voice, like the crying a seagull, strange and vindictive. The rabbit made itself into a ball in the air, and lashed out, flinging itself into a bow. It really seemed demoniacal. Gudrun saw Gerald's body tighten, saw a sharp blindness come into his eyes. "I know these beggars of old," he said. The long, demon-like beast lashed out again, spread on the air as if it were flying, looking something like a dragon, then closing up again, inconceivably powerful and explosive. The man's body, strung to its efforts, vibrated strongly. Then a sudden sharp, white-edged wrath came up in him. Swift as lightning he drew back and brought his free hand down like a hawk on the neck of the rabbit. Simultaneously, there came the unearthly abhorrent scream of a rabbit in the fear of death. It made one immense writhe, tore his wrists and his sleeves in a final convulsion, all its belly flashed white in a whirlwind of paws, and then he had slung it round and had it under his arm, fast. It cowered and skulked. His face was gleaming with a smile. "You wouldn't think there was all that force in a rabbit," he said, looking at Gudrun. And he saw her eyes black as night in her pallid face. She looked almost unearthly. The scream of the rabbit, after the violent tussle, seemed to have torn the veil of her consciousness. He looked at her, and the whitish, electric gleam in his face intensified. "I don't really like him," Winifred was crooning. "I don't care for him as I do for Lucy. He's hateful really." A smile twisted Gudrun's face, as she recovered. She knew she was revealed. "Don't they make the most fearful noise when they scream?" she cried, the high note in her voice, like a seagull's cry. "Abominable," he said. "He shouldn't be so silly when he has to be taken out," Winifred was saying, putting out her hand and touching the rabbit tentatively, as it skulked under his arm, motionless as if it were dead. "He's not dead, is he, Gerald?" she asked. "No, he ought to be," he said. "Yes, he ought," cried the child, with a sudden flush of amusement. And she touched the rabbit with more confidence. "His heart is beating so fast. Isn't he funny? He really is. Where do you want him?" asked Gerald. "In the little green court," she said. Gudrun looked at Gerald with strange, darkened eyes, strained with underworld knowledge, almost supplicating, like those of a creature which is at his mercy, yet which is his ultimate victor. He did not know what to say to her. He felt the mutual hellish recognition. And he felt he ought to say something, to cover it. He had the power of lightning in his nerves. She seemed like a soft recipient of his magical, hideous white fire. He was unconfident, he had qualms of fear. "Did he hurt you?" he asked. "No," she said. "He's an insensible beast," he said, turning his face away. They came to the little court, which was shut in by old red walls in whose crevices wallflowers were growing. The grass was soft and fine and old, a level floor carpeting the court, the sky was blue overhead. Gerald tossed the rabbit down. It crouched still and would not move. Gudrun watched it with faint horror. "Why doesn't it move?" she cried. "It's skulking," he said. She looked up at him, and a slight sinister smile contracted her white face. "Isn't it a fool?" she cried. "Isn't it a sickening fool?" The vindictive mockery in her voice made his brain quiver. Glancing up at him, into his eyes, she revealed again the mocking, white cruel recognition. There was a league between them, abhorrent to them both. They were implicated with each other in abhorrent mysteries. "How many scratches have you?" he asked, showing his hard forearm, white and hard untorn in red gashes. "How really vile!" she cried, flushing with a sinister vision. "Mine is nothing." She lifted her arm and showed a deep red score down the silken white flesh. "What a devil!" he exclaimed. But it was as if he had had knowledge of her in the long red rent of her forearm, so silken and soft. He did not want to touch her. He would have to make himself touch her, deliberately. The long, shallow red rip seemed torn across his own brain, tearing the surface of his ultimate consciousness, letting through the forever unconscious, unthinkable red ether of the beyond, the obscene beyond. "It doesn't hurt you very much, does it?" he asked, solicitous. "Not at all," she cried. And suddenly the rabbit, which had been crouching as if it were a flower, so still and soft, suddenly burst into life. Round and round the court it went, as if shot from a gun, round and round like a furry meteorite, in a tense hard circle that seemed to bind their brains. They all stood in amazement, smiling uncannily, as if the rabbit were obeying some unknown incantation. Round and round it flew, on the grass under the old red walls like a storm. And then quite suddenly it settled down, hobbled among the grass, and sat considering, its nose twitching like a bit of fluff in the wind. After having considered for a few minutes, a soft bunch with a black, open eye, which perhaps was looking at them, perhaps was not, it hobbled calmly forward and began to nibble the grass with that mean motion of a rabbit's quick eating. "It's mad," said Gudrun. "It is most decidedly mad." He laughed. "The question is," he said, "what is madness? I don't suppose it is rabbit mad." "Don't you think it is?" she asked. "No. That's what it is to be a rabbit." There was a queer, faint, obscene smile over his face. She looked at him and saw him, and knew that he was initiate as she was initiate. This thwarted her, and contravened her, for the moment. "God be praised we aren't rabbits," she said, in a high, shrill voice. The smile intensified a little, on his face. "Not rabbits?" he said, looking at her fixedly. Slowly her face relaxed into a smile of obscene recognition. "Ah, Gerald," she said, in a strong, slow, almost man-like way. "All that, and more." Her eyes looked up at him with shocking nonchalance. He felt again as if she had torn him across the breast, dully, finally. He turned aside. Eat, my darling." Winifred was softly conjuring the rabbit, and creeping forward to touch it. It hobbled away from her. "Let its mother stroke its fur then, darling, because it is so mysterious."